I have 20 minutes to discuss 20 years of language industry and the changes. So I worked this out last night on the train from Munich to Berlin. That's 1 minute per year. You get the same answer. So let's go 1999. Okay, I'm not going to do it like that. That would be very boring. But let's go back to 1999. Looking around the room, I guess most of you were born then. Probably a lot of you were involved in the language industry. Just try, if you were, try to take yourself back to 1999 and try to imagine what you were thinking about. And I can guarantee one thing you weren't thinking about is what will the language industry look like in 20 years' time? You weren't thinking about 2019, you weren't thinking about 2020. The only thing you might have been thinking about is, will the world end at the end of 1999? Planes were going to crash, computers were going to crash, the Y2K problem, you might remember that. But let's go back anyway. For me, briefly, 1999, I was 40. I thought I was old. Now, 20 years later, I'm 50. 10 years earlier, I'd come to Germany in 1989 from Britain. I'd worked as a journalist, I'd worked as a translator, I'd worked as a business English teacher here. I wasn't qualified for any of those jobs, but it didn't stop me. And I say that to point out that actually, in the language industry, we are in some ways an underqualified industry. And that hasn't really changed. In fact, in some ways, it's got worse. I came to Spotlight Verlag in 1992. The company already existed since 1981, and now we're a part of the Zeit Verlag, based in Hamburg. Our office is Spotlight are in Munich. I started at the general English magazine Spotlight, and in 1995 I became editor-in-chief of that magazine. So if I think what I was doing 20 years ago, on the 29th of August 1999, I was probably busy editing Spotlight. Actually, I hope I wasn't, because it was a Sunday. But I probably was. And what we were finishing was we were finishing a magazine that had on the cover a story called Test, How Good Is Your Business English? It also had another topic called Politics, because I looked this up, Politics, Britain's problem with Germany. Today it would be Britain's problem with everybody. And that magazine, which was actually our bestseller, was the impulse for starting a magazine purely for business English, which first appeared in 2001. And it's interesting because back then, I remember when I talked to our CEO at the time about this idea, I said, I think we should produce a new print magazine. And it's hard to imagine now, but even back then, that was an idea that seemed terribly old-fashioned. Because 1999, we were in the dot-com hype, which crashed later and then came back. But I was convinced at the time that this was a market, the print market, that would for a long time be a very attractive and profitable one. And actually it has proved to be, despite all the changes. The print remains at the core of our portfolio, although we've added in a lot of products around our magazines for English, business English, French, Spanish, Italian, and German as a foreign language. And I think one important function, despite all that's going on and all the way we've seen, in many ways, the industry split into different parts, is that a central product like a magazine can act as a focus. It acts as a focus in a time where there's so much information, the role of curating, the role of combining language with learning about what's going on in the world. In a sense, multitasking. In a time when people are poor, they can do 2 or 3 things at the same time. And that remains, I think, a very important function. So in a sense, you could say that with that decision 20 years ago, we got that right. But we didn't get everything right. And I'm going to move on from Spotlight to the industry more generally. And we didn't see all the changes that were coming. So for example, in 1999, we launched a magazine for teenagers to learn English, a younger version of Spotlight. It was called Spot On. It lasted until 2012, but it was basically killed off by a development that appeared 5 years after its launch, which nobody had seen coming. We hadn't seen it coming. I doubt if any of you had seen it coming. If you had, you'd have started it yourself. It was called Facebook. The audience for Spot On was teenagers, and primarily teenage girls, because they read a lot more than teenage boys, or they did at the time. And with Facebook, suddenly there was something much more interesting to do with your time. So the disruption, the competition came from, not from a similar product, not even from a language learning product. It came from something completely different, something we hadn't foreseen. Something that you might call, in the language of the former American Defense Minister Donald Rumsfeld, an unknown unknown. We didn't even know that we didn't know it. And that will be maybe an interesting thought for our panel discussion later, if we're thinking about where things are going in the future. For the remaining time, what I want to do is to talk about some of the trends in the industry as I see them. It's a very personal view, and you all see a different section or sector of our industry. The way I've decided to do it is by answering some of the standard journalistic questions. These are things like that any good story should answer. What happened? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen? Who was involved? And who cares? Before I do that, let me pick up two really important things that I'd almost forgotten them, but these are developments that are so important we cannot underestimate their significance. 2001, so 2 years in, saw the launch of the Common European Framework of Reference. Now, it's just impossible for us to imagine our industry now without that. Before that, there was a complete myriad of descriptions of language levels and tasks and all that kind of thing. That's a real, in a sense, game changer. Not perfect, but a game changer. The second one, and that's why I'm very pleased to see a representative of the European Commission, was, and I hope this is right, but I believe first agreed at the European Council in 2002, was the policy that everybody should learn 2 languages in addition to their mother tongues, all EU countries, I believe. I mean, I would say good luck with the UK on that. You may not have to worry about that problem much longer. As far as the EU goes, so obviously other things like the Council of Europe and the Eurovision Song Contest will still be there. Another big trend, I think, within the industry, and a lot of what I say relates to my experience with English, but I think we can pick it up in other situations, is we suddenly started looking at people, users of language, differently, and terms like native speaker and non-native speaker, on the one hand, became sort of politically incorrect. They became to a large extent irrelevant, and we looked at these two groups differently. We didn't look at non-native speaker language as incorrect, as mistakes. We didn't look at non-native speaker teachers as inferior, in fact, in some cases quite the opposite. And we also identified the native speaker of a language as often the cause of communication problems, whereas they had been seen before as the fount of all wisdom. And again, that's a big change in the way you look at people. Another big change is we understand a lot more now about the way language is used through corpora research, where we can analyse huge data banks of language. We can see the way the language is used in practice, and we can draw conclusions that are closer to the reality than the theoretical conclusions that one found in the past in grammar books, etc. Let me move on to the what now. The what? We've seen obviously big changes in the languages that people are learning. We've seen in many a relative decline in English, and in some cases an absolute decline. We've seen in recent years a huge, as you all know, increase in the demand for German as a foreign language. Again, not something anybody was really thinking about in 1999. If they were, they thought it might come from East, Central and Eastern Europe. We launched a magazine in 2005. It was quite a slow burner until it took off when suddenly, after the financial crisis, so many people came from Southern Europe and the demand increased. Later with refugees, but it was the financial crisis that was the thing there. Nobody in 1999 was thinking of the financial crisis of 2007-8. In business English, which is my specialist area, I think one of the big changes, and we asked a number of experts for an upcoming magazine that comes out next Wednesday. We asked trainers the changes they had observed, and one big change is the change away from English for the sake of learning English and towards English to communicate. And in a sense, I think we set ourselves in a sense too much as language people rather than communication. We don't learn languages in most cases for the sake of it, we learn to communicate. Increasingly in the business world, people learn for a very specific purpose. They know what it is they've got to do and when. As opposed to what used to be described sort of half-jokingly as English for no specific purpose. You didn't really know why you were learning it, but it was kind of a good thing. Nowadays it's much more focused, it's much more outcome-driven, and it's about getting the communicative job done. And in a way, the job is to see how can we help people to minimize the risk of miscommunication. If we can do that, that is a huge task done. Minimize the risk of miscommunication. Sometimes people say, well, nowadays everybody's coming out of school with higher language levels and those kinds of things. There's some truth in that, but again, are they competent communicators? In most cases, no, which means there's markets there for us to help people to become better communicators. There's been an increased demand in soft skills, intercultural skills, interpersonal skills. On the who side, we've seen a change in people learning the languages. Many more people now have to learn English before and other languages. We've got a much broader range of providers in the market. Sometimes people talk about yin and yang. In our industry, it's ling and lang. So we have a whole range of companies with either ling or lang or products in their name. I don't know if any of you know the American music legend Chuck Berry. His only #1 hit in England was called My Ding-a-Ling. Shockingly bad song. But I looked last night, if anybody's interested in setting up a company or a product called My Ding-a-Lingua, last night at 8:30, that website was still available. But seriously, we're an incredibly dynamic sector. We have companies growing up in all sorts of areas, whether it's online training, through apps, through the whole concept now of language influencer. I mean, nobody's heard of a language influencer in 1999. I hadn't even heard of it about a year ago. So these are incredibly exciting developments in our industry. We are a very dynamic industry. There's also in terms of where and when people are going to learn, the language industry used to be a little bit like the TV industry. There were sort of like 3 or 4 big players, and you had to watch the things at the time when the people told you they were going to send it, and they were going to broadcast their programs. And of course now it's I learn when I want, I learn where I want, I learn how I want. We're not quite there yet. We're actually in a kind of transition paradox period where there's a demand for greater individualization. At the same time, there is still a lot of pressure, particularly in the corporate sector, for standardization, because people believe that will save costs. They want one provider provides all, and there's a tension there between standardization and individualization. There's a tension between providing general language and providing specific language. It's a tension that we wrestle with at Business Spotlight all the time, and I guess many of you do in your sectors as well. And in this very dynamic, chaotic, developing industry, there will, I think, but this is moving on to the future, be a need for curators to create an element of order within this chaos. Why are people learning? Again, I think there's been a shift of motivation, speaking, generalizing between the motivation I want to do this and the motivation I have to do this, obviously particularly in the business world. The cultural aspect is still there, the love of countries. We see that particularly, for example, with Italy, with our magazine Adesso, or Écoute with our magazine about France. Business Spotlight, Deutsch Perfect, the prime drivers are, I have to get things done, I have to get better, I have to be a better communicator. Maybe at some point the pressure to learn Chinese, or at least the pressure to be competent communicating with people who speak Chinese English. That could be a key skill. So what? Coming to the end. Well, one whole area that I've kind of touched on in various places is technology. And I don't have time to go into a lot of that, but we did an extensive interview for our upcoming magazine of Business Spotlight with Evan Frender. Many of you will know Evan. He lives in Berlin. He's one of the world's leading experts in business English. He says a number of provocative things in his article, one of which is technology may well mean that in the future fewer people need to learn languages. He reports on his 20-minute conversation with his Chinese taxi driver, where through an app they are communicating about a whole range of topics. Evan can't speak Chinese, the Chinese taxi driver cannot speak English, they are communicating. For some people that's a frightening thought. For anybody who makes money out of language and communication training, it's a very frightening thought, but it's one that we should at least face up to. So, my last cheat sheet, my last note. August the 29th, 2039. That's 20 years' time. What will we be doing? Try to imagine it. We'll discuss it, I'm sure, in the panel discussion later. What will I be doing? I'll be 80. It's a Monday. I looked it up. It's a Monday. That means at Spotlight Verlag, I will still be working. We have a colleague, a Spanish colleague, who recently retired or semi-retired at the age of 90. He's sort of retired, but he still comes in. So they don't let you go. I'll still be there. What will the language world look like? One thing is certain. As certain as the fact that in 1999 we weren't thinking about 2019. And the one thing is certain is that I, and probably you, have no idea what it will look like. None at all. Thank you.